The morning sun rose lazy and golden over my farm, casting soft light on the dew-kissed fields, but nothing about what I saw next felt gentle. There it was, hanging between my two oldest, most beloved oak trees, a floral print hammock swaying like it had always belonged there. The problem? It sure as hell didn't. I hadn't tied it. I hadn't approved it. And stitched right onto the corner, like some twisted signature, was the name Karen, as if that somehow made it hers by divine right. My stomach dropped, then boiled. Karen, the self-declared queen of the nearby HOA, had struck again, except this time she'd crossed the line, literally, onto my private farm without so much as a knock on my door. What sent me into a full, jaw-clenching silence wasn't just the hammock, but the sheer audacity of it all. A tray of iced lemonade and a folded picnic blanket were set up underneath it, as if I was just supposed to host her little fantasy like some unpaid farmhand. I stood there, gripping my coffee cup so tight it almost cracked, feeling a storm brew under my skin. She didn't just borrow space, she invaded it like it was a community garden. I should have expected it, considering Karen's history. Ever since she moved into the subdivision bordering my property, she treated the whole countryside like her personal yoga retreat. My farm was not, has never been, and would never be part of the HOA, yet Karen acted like every patch of grass within sight of her kitchen window fell under her jurisdiction. She had suggested before that my farm would look better if I tore down my weathered barn and built a quaint little event space for neighborhood gatherings. I laughed then, thinking surely no one could be that clueless. Apparently, I underestimated her. Later that day, I marched down to Karen's perfectly manicured porch, where plastic flamingos guarded the walkway like pink soldiers. Karen answered the door with that familiar, smug smile, dressed in a sun hat and floral print that eerily matched the hammock fabric. When I asked, calmly but firmly, about the hammock, her response almost made me forget every nice thing my mother ever taught me about manners. "Oh, you noticed it? Isn't it just perfect there? I thought it would really add to the community charm." Community charm? On my property? Karen fluttered her hand like I was being silly. "Don't be so uptight, it's just a hammock." It wasn't just a hammock. It was a line drawn in the dirt, and Karen had stomped across it in muddy boot. I tried reasoning, reminding her that my farm wasn't part of the HOA and was clearly marked as private land. Karen chuckled, eyes scanning over my shoulder toward the trees. "Oh, come on now. Those trees practically lean into the subdivision. They're begging to be enjoyed by everyone. Besides, I'm hosting a little garden party next weekend, and I thought it'd be a lovely feature. You'll hardly notice us." She didn't even ask. She announced it like I should be flattered. As I walked back to the farmhouse, I knew two things for certain. One, Karen fully intended to make this her spot, hammock and all, without any intention of removing it. And two, if I let this slide, next she'd be stringing fairy lights across my fence and claiming my pasture as overflow parking for her HOA wine night. The problem with folks like Karen is that they don't understand fences, locks, or deeds. They only understand lessons, and sometimes those lessons need to sting. For the rest of the evening, I paced the farmhouse like a storm cloud ready to burst. My farm was more than land to me. It was a legacy. My granddad planted those oak trees himself, back when the land was wilder, tougher, and free of plastic flamingos and HOA Karens. Those trees had survived storms, droughts, and even a tornado that took half the barn roof one summer. They didn't deserve to be reduced to lawn ornaments for someone's weekend mimosa hour. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. It was one of the few neighbors who hadn't lost their spine to Karen's bullying. "You see what she did now?" he asked, barely able to hide his amusement. Turns out Karen had already sent out invitations for the garden party, labeling the hammock spot as Karen's Secret Garden Lounge. Not even an ounce of shame. The flyer had gone out to half the county. I leaned back against the counter, staring out the window at the hammock swaying softly in the wind, almost daring me to let it slide. That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't going to listen to words, complaints, or politely worded requests. She'd already rewritten the rules. If she wanted to play dirty, well, I was born and raised in the dirt. I wasn't going to call the sheriff. I wasn't going to argue. And I sure as heck wasn't going to just take it down and hand it back like some meek little farmhand scared of suburban royalty. No, I had something far more fitting in mind. A plan started to form, old school and sharp, just like the thorns growing wild out by the south fence line. If Karen wanted to hang around my trees so bad, maybe I'd give her a reason to remember them. Not all ropes are soft, and not every lesson is gentle. And so, the preparations began. What Karen didn't know was that she wasn't just borrowing my trees. She was about to borrow trouble. That night, as the wind whistled through the rafters of my old farmhouse, I sat by the window staring at Karen's hammock as if it were some kind of insult carved into my land. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head, all sugary and smug, calling it a community charm. I knew better than to let anger make me sloppy. This wasn't about getting even. It was about making sure Karen never mistook my property for a public park again. I'd spent my entire life out here learning the quiet lessons of the land, and if there's one thing farming teaches you, it's patience. Karen would get hers, but it had to be just right. No shouting, no warnings, just a firm reminder of why you don't mess with another person's land. I got up before dawn the next morning, pulled on my boots, and went to the back fence where wild rose bushes had been left to grow freely for years. Anyone else might have seen a tangle of thorny vines and weeds. I saw the perfect solution. Those vines had character. Thick, twisted, and covered with wicked little thorns sharp enough to teach respect without leaving permanent scars. I spent the next few hours carefully trimming them, stripping away just enough leaves to make sure the thorns stood out, yet blending it well enough with the weathered look of Karen's cheap hammock rope. I worked with the precision of a surgeon. Every knot, every loop, every hidden barb was set exactly where it needed to be. From a distance, you'd never guess anything had changed. The ropes still looked like regular old hammock ties, a little rustic maybe, but nothing out of place. But the moment someone threw their weight into it, well, let's just say they'd have an unforgettable experience. I couldn't help but grin at the thought. Not cruel, just corrective. While I was at it, I carved a sign. Not some angry warning like Karen probably expected from a so-called grumpy old farmer, but something simple, poetic even. The words read, "Private property. Uninvited guests may find this place a bit painful." I sanded the edges smooth and stained it just enough to make it look like it had always belonged there. By the time the sun dipped low and the crickets started their evening chorus, I had the hammock rigged, the sign hung, and the stage set. The next couple of days passed with an eerie quiet. Karen didn't show up right away, which worried me more than if she had. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. I caught glimpses of her in the distance, parading around with her little HOA clipboard, probably making sure the neighbors trimmed their hedges to regulation height. But I could tell something was brewing. Sure enough, by Saturday afternoon, Karen returned, prancing toward the hammock like she'd just inherited the whole farm. I watched from the shadow of the barn, not out of cruelty but curiosity. I wanted to see if she'd even notice the changes. Of course, she didn't. Karen sauntered up with a pair of her equally entitled friends, both wearing matching straw hats and holding iced teas like they were extras in some off-brand country club commercial. She waved toward the trees. "See? Isn't it just darling?" she said, guiding them toward the hammock as if she were a tour guide showing off ancient ruins. They oh'd and awed, snapping photos like they were about to be featured in some high-society garden magazine. I could barely contain myself when Karen flopped into the hammock with all the grace of a bowling ball. The second her weight shifted, the thorns did their job. There wasn't a sound at first, just the sharp intake of breath as Karen registered what was happening. Then came the shriek, high-pitched, theatrical, and echoing clear across the field. She shot up, arms flailing, clothes snagging on the vines, and tumbled backwards into the dirt. Her friends gasped, not knowing whether to help her or pretend they didn't know her. Karen stumbled to her feet, leaves and grass stuck to her sun hat, and spun around looking for someone to blame. When her eyes landed on the little wooden sign, she squinted at it like it had personally insulted her. "Private property?" she read aloud, voice rising. "Painful?" She spun back toward the hammock, now obviously tangled with thorns, though not so obvious that she could prove foul play. Her friends were already backing away, murmuring about how maybe it was just nature reclaiming its space. I stayed hidden behind the barn wall, pressing a hand over my mouth to keep from laughing out loud. Karen's ego took a bigger hit than her backside, but that was the point. It wasn't just the physical sting. It was the humiliation. Karen wasn't used to being embarrassed. She was used to running the show, barking orders, and having everyone politely nod and obey. Now, in front of her own friends, she looked like a fool. She stormed off not long after, muttering about calling the HOA, the sheriff, and anyone else who might listen. I knew better than to worry. The sheriff had been out here enough times to know where my property line was, and more importantly, he wasn't exactly fond of Karen's antics either. This wasn't the city. Out here, people understood boundaries, both physical and personal. Karen could rant all she wanted, but no one was going to care about her scratched ego or her ruined garden party plans. Later that evening, I went out to check the hammock. Sure enough, Karen had left it in place, though it now hung limp and sad, sagging from where she'd yanked at it in frustration. The sign remained untouched. I took a slow walk around the edge of the field, letting the cool breeze calm me down. This wasn't just about a hammock anymore. It was about drawing the line once and for all. Karen had gotten her warning. Whether she learned from it or not was up to her. What I didn't expect, though, was just how deep Karen's stubbornness ran. Most folks would have taken the hint. Most folks would have packed up their hammock and their pride and never dared set foot on my land again. But as I walked back toward the farmhouse, I noticed something unsettling. There were fresh tire tracks leading up the dirt path along the fence line. Karen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And something told me that what came next would make the hammock stunt look like child's play. The following morning, I woke up to the clatter of gravel against my front porch. When I stepped outside, there she was, Karen, standing at the edge of my driveway like she owned the place, arms crossed, and flanked by two men in crisp polos with HOA badges clipped to their belt. The sight alone was laughable. My farm was miles outside the HOA's jurisdiction, but that didn't stop her from parading them onto my property like they were the county sheriff and his deputy. Karen's voice rang out before I even got a word in. She accused me of sabotaging her property, endangering her safety, and damaging the community's aesthetic integrity. The two HOA officers stood there awkwardly, clearly realizing they were on private farmland, but Karen's dramatic storytelling didn't give them room to intervene. According to her, the thorn-rigged hammock was a criminal trap and I was the villain of some suburban soap opera. I leaned against the porch rail, sipping my coffee without saying a word, just watching them try to make sense of where they were. After she finally took a breath, one of the officers cleared his throat and politely reminded her that my land wasn't part of the HOA. Karen's eyes twitched as if someone had slapped her. The officer even pointed out that the marked boundary stones clearly showed where the HOA's authority stopped. Karen waved it off like a minor technicality. She wasn't giving up that easily. She swore she'd be back with the sheriff and stormed off, leaving the two officers exchanging glances like they'd just survived a mild natural disaster. Sure enough, later that afternoon, the sheriff showed up. He was a good man, old school, and knew better than anyone where my property lines began and ended. I gave him the rundown, showed him the flyers Karen had passed around advertising her garden party on land she didn't own, and let him see the sign I'd put up by the hammock. He chuckled, shook his head, and told me not to worry. He promised Karen wasn't going to find a court in the state willing to hear her case. But as he pulled away, he gave me a warning I hadn't expected. He'd seen Karen types before. The kind who double down when they lose. The kind who don't take no for an answer. I should have known right then that it wasn't over. 2 days later, just as I was fixing a loose board on the back fence, I spotted movement down by the hammock trees. My stomach sank when I saw Karen. She wasn't alone. This time, she'd brought reinforcements. Half the HOA committee, it seemed, and they were busy stringing up a whole new hammock. Not just any hammock either. This one looked straight out of a resort catalog, bigger, fancier, and strung up with fresh ropes, fairy lights, and even a couple of tiki torches planted in the ground beneath it. They were laughing, setting up folding chairs, coolers, and a little makeshift sign that read, "Karen's Retreat, open to all." It was as if she wanted to make sure everyone could see just how much control she thought she had. I stood behind the fence, gripping the top rail so tight my knuckles went white. She hadn't just ignored my warning, she'd doubled down. Worse, she'd turned it into a spectacle. Karen had turned my quiet corner of the farm into some ridiculous imitation of a beach resort. The audacity was staggering. The insult was louder than any words she could have said. But the thing about farming is, you don't last long if you panic. You think. You plan. You wait for the right season. That night, I sat on the porch with an old notebook in my lap. It had belonged to my grandfather, full of half-sketched contraptions and clever solutions to farm problems. But tucked between pages on how to fix a busted water pump and keep crows out of the corn, I found exactly what I needed. A simple, harmless trick we used to call the rope-a-dope. The next morning, while Karen was busy recruiting more volunteers to decorate her hammock spot, I got to work. By midday, I had rigged the ropes, fairy lights, and tiki torches so carefully you'd never suspect a thing. The ropes were loosened just enough to release with the right amount of weight. Not dangerous, but effective. The lights were strung to snap and dangle like a broken necklace, and the hammock itself was primed to tip forward, directly into a freshly churned patch of cow manure I had conveniently prepared beneath the grass. I stayed quiet, letting her dig her own hole deeper. Karen had planned a full garden party for Saturday. Invitations were already making their rounds on social media, complete with photos of her setup captioned, "The perfect escape, join us this weekend." The whole neighborhood, including people who wouldn't dare cross me otherwise, were buzzing about it. Some folks were too polite to refuse. Others were too curious to miss what they suspected would be a disaster. The day of the party, the farm felt like a strange cross between a country fair and a circus. Cars lined the gravel road, guests strolled around sipping lemonade and wine spritzers, and Karen, wearing an oversized sun hat and a matching floral dress, was in rare form, playing hostess like she was queen of the county. I stayed out of sight, working quietly in the far pasture, pretending to mind my own business but keeping one eye on the spectacle. When the time was just right, Karen, in full view of her guests, settled into her hammock like Cleopatra onto a throne. She rocked gently, waved to the crowd, and then came the moment I'd been waiting for. With a soft creak, the ropes slipped. The hammock tilted. The fairy lights snapped loose, flickering out like fireflies. Karen's smile faltered. And then, with a gasp and a flurry of flailing arms, she tipped forward, landing squarely into the patch of fresh cow manure. Gasps turned into stunned silence. Then, like wildfire, the laughter spread. Even her closest allies couldn't hold it in. Karen scrambled up, covered in mud, manure, and grass, her hat flattened and hanging from her neck like a wilted flower. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded. Guests whispered. And in the middle of it all, Karen, queen of the HOA, stood dripping and defeated. But it wasn't over yet. She spun around looking for someone to blame, eyes landing on the little wooden sign still hanging nearby. The same one she'd ignored. Private property. Uninvited guests may find this place a bit painful. The realization dawned across her manure-streaked face like a thundercloud. But there was nothing she could do. Not without admitting she'd trespassed. Not without confessing that she'd staged her whole little coup on someone else's land. I didn't even need to show myself. I just sat on the pasture fence, watching from a distance as Karen's party slowly dissolved, guests shuffling back to their cars, whispering and chuckling as they went. Karen had wanted to make an impression, and she did. Just not the one she had in mind. As the sun set behind the hills, I could already feel it in my bones. Karen wasn't finished yet, but after today, she'd be thinking twice before making her next move. The next few days rolled by in a strange sort of quiet, the kind that comes after a storm but still leaves the air feeling heavy. Karen hadn't been seen near the trees since the party, and for a brief moment I thought maybe, just maybe, she had learned her lesson. But deep down I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to swallow embarrassment without spitting something worse right back. Sure enough, on the third day, a sealed envelope showed up on my porch. No knock, no doorbell, just the crisp edge of a legal-looking letter slid halfway under my front door. Inside was a cease and desist, signed by some big-shot lawyer out of town who probably didn't even know where the city limits ended. Karen was accusing me of harassment, endangerment, property damage, and a half-dozen other made-up charges. She even attached photos from her manure mishap, like it was going to make a judge weep for her dry-cleaning bill. I sat there on the porch, letter in hand, watching the goats chew lazily on the fence line, and I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't the kind of chuckle you let out when something's funny, it was the slow-building, are-you-serious kind of laugh, the one you get when someone's stupidity crosses into legendary territory. Karen wasn't giving up. She was digging herself in deeper, and I was about to help her with the shovel. I knew she hadn't done her homework. Karen, for all her HOA rules and printed flyers, had no idea about the real boundary that separated my farm from the neighborhood. A good portion of the back acreage, including the very spot where she'd staged her hammock empire, wasn't just private property. It was protected under a federal conservation easement, locked in place years ago by my grandfather and the local historical society. Not only was Karen trespassing, but she was technically interfering with protected land, the kind of land where even accidentally stepping on a rare flower could get you slapped with a fine big enough to make you sell your SUV. The next day, I made sure Karen got her own special delivery. I printed off a copy of the conservation easement paperwork, highlighted the boundary lines, and attached photos from the town archives showing the oak trees marked as heritage trees. Just for good measure, I added a note suggesting she contact the county clerk's office before sending any more lawyers my way. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, Karen came storming down the gravel path in her SUV, tires kicking up dust, face red as a beet. She waved the papers out the window like they were on fire and slammed on the brakes so hard I thought the tires might pop. "You can't be serious," she yelled before I even reached the gate. "This can't be real." I calmly opened the old wooden gate and leaned on it, watching her melt down like a discount wax candle. I pointed out the signatures on the paperwork. The local conservation officer, the town historian, and even a judge. Karen's eyes darted over the names as if trying to will them into disappearing. "You're bluffing," she spat, but even she knew it was no bluff. "You're going to pay for this," she threatened, voice shaking not with anger but panic. She wasn't used to being outplayed. Karen had always been able to bully her way through HOA meetings and bake sales, but out here, among the barbed wire and cattle gates, her rules didn't mean squat. By the end of the week, the fallout hit like a slow-moving storm. Word spread faster than wildfire, especially after someone, and I'm not saying it was me, but I'm not denying it, slipped the conservation papers and a few choice snapshots from the garden party into the next HOA newsletter. Suddenly, the neighborhood grapevine was ripe with gossip. Karen hadn't just embarrassed herself, she had dragged the entire HOA into a trespassing scandal. The county got involved, issuing her a hefty fine for disturbing protected land and ordering her to perform community service to make up for the damage done to the conservation area. The sight of Karen picking up trash at the local park in her designer sunglasses and wide-brimmed sun hat was something I wouldn't soon forget. It wasn't just the fine or the service hours that broke her spirit. It was the fact that, for once, everyone saw her for what she was. Neighbors who once nodded politely at her HOA memos now crossed the street to avoid her. The same friends who toasted wine spritzers under my oak trees were suddenly too busy to return her calls. Karen's perfect little social bubble popped, and there wasn't a soul left to patch it. Her garden party dreams withered like sun-scorched flowers. A few weeks later, I noticed the inevitable. A shiny new for sale sign planted in Karen's front yard, right next to the flamingos that now looked more like prisoners than decorations. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just nodded to myself, knowing things were back the way they ought to be. Peaceful. Quiet. No rogue hammocks swaying where they didn't belong. The farm seemed to breathe easier too. The oak trees stood proud and undisturbed, their branches free from the strain of Karen's nonsense. The goats went back to lounging by the fence, and even the rooster seemed less ornery. Life returned to its normal rhythm. But just when I thought it was all behind me, I spotted something that made me chuckle all over again. Out by the goat pen, half buried in mud and thoroughly chewed to bits, was one of Karen's original garden party flyers. The goats must have gotten hold of it during all the excitement and given it a proper farm-style critique. As I leaned on the fence, watching the sun dip below the hills, I realized something simple but satisfying. You don't need to yell to make a point. You don't have to fight loud to win. Sometimes, all it takes is patience, a little creativity, and the willingness to let people trip over their own entitlement. Karen learned that the hard way. And out here on the farm, that's just the way we like it.